Good evening and welcome to Masterminds 2021, the Zoom edition. To begin, I want to acknowledge the, with respect, the Algonquin-speaking peoples on whose territory the University of Victoria stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wixanich peoples with who we share this wonderful place on Earth. My name is John Anderson. I'm the past president of the University of Victoria Retirees Association, and I'd like to welcome you to this Mastermind series, which is an initiative to foster university community engagement with the public in a high quality lectures at the University of Victoria. And tonight's presentation will certainly add to that series. The Mastermind series began in 2007. It was initiated by Beverly Timmons, who is a member of the Retirees Association board, and Elaine Gallagher, who was the director of what was then known as the Center of Aging and is now the Institute on Aging and Lifelong Health, which is the partner with the Retirees Association for the Masterminds series. This year, as you may have noticed, we are no longer in a lecture theater on campus, but rather on Zoom in a webinar format. We're also pleased this year to be able to provide closed captioning from the Island Deaf and Hard of Hearing Center, and Ali Bosley is giving us a hand with those captions. And I should mention, before I forget, that moving to the Zoom format has been masterminded by Leah Potter from the Institute of Aging and Lifelong Health. Now, before beginning and introducing Dr. Nancy Turner, there's just a few housekeeping tasks I should remind you of or inform you of. Seeing as we are on Zoom, if you'll notice on the bottom of your screen, your Zoom screen, there's a little tab called Q&A. If you want to ask a question during the presentation, just open up that tab and type in your question. These will be collected throughout the presentation, and at the end of the presentation, I'll select a number of the questions to pose to Dr. Turner. Some other things, as audience members, your audio is going to be muted and only the presenter's video will be on screen. The event is being recorded and will be available, I think, starting Friday from the websites of either the University of Victoria Retirees Association or the Institute on Aging and Lifelong Health. So let us begin. We are very honored this evening to have Dr. Nancy Turner with us. She is a renowned ethnobotanist and a distinguished professor emeritus at the School of Environmental Studies here at the University of Victoria. She has worked with First Nations elders and cultural specialists in northwestern North America for over 50 years, helping to document, retain, and promote their traditional knowledge of plants and environments, including indigenous foods, materials, and traditional medicines. She has been formally adopted into the Haida, Kwakwaka, Wak, Songhees, and Nishka families. She has written and co-written over 30 books, plus numerous academic papers. Her latest edited book is entitled Plants, People, and Places: The Roles of Ethnobotany and Ethnoecology in Indigenous Peoples' Land Rights in Canada and Beyond. And she's been recognized for her work, well-deserved, of course, many times, including she's a member of the Order of British Columbia, the Order of Canada. She's been given honorary degrees from University of British Columbia, University of Northern British Columbia, University of Vancouver Island, Simon Fraser University. So you can imagine the anticipation. I know I'm looking forward to her presentation. And her presentation is entitled Plants, People, and Places, Lessons in Stewardship and Reciprocity. I would like you to welcome Dr. Nancy Turner.
Thank you so much, John, for that kind introduction, and good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you today, this evening, and I like to imagine that we're all sitting in a big room together and I'm able to see your faces, and hope you enjoy the evening as much as I plan to. I have a PowerPoint presentation which I want to share with you this evening. And so I think we'll just get started right away with that. I'm going to try and share my screen. And I've done this once or twice before in the last little while. And see if I can do this. We have a backup plan if it doesn't work. Let's try that again. Leah, I don't know what I did here. I tried to share my screen and I'm not sure how I did this, but it didn't work. Okay, let's try this again. No. I can't seem to make my screen share. Okay, try this. Is that working yet? There. I think Leah, the wizard, was able to share her screen. So Leah, thank you very much. We'll have to do, I'll just tell Leah when it's time to change the screen. And so like John, I want to also acknowledge with respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the University of Victoria stands, and also to thank the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Saanich peoples whose ancestors have lived in this and looked after this area for thousands of years, and whose historical relationships with this land continue to the present day. I also want to recognize and acknowledge the Snuneymuxw peoples on whose territory I am living currently here on Protection Island off Nanaimo. Next slide, please, Leah. Thank you. I want to thank John and Leah and the past organizers of these mastermind events. Takes a lot of work to organize these kinds of talks, especially when they're remote. And I really appreciate being a part of this program. I think it's great. Also want to thank Ali Bonsley for the closed captions for tonight, and the Lafayette Strings Quartet, whose music we were enjoying before we started the program. Many people, colleagues and friends and collaborators I would like to thank. Some of them are mentioned here by name, and also I want to recognize the School of Environmental Studies, the Restoration of Natural Systems program, the Hakai Institute, and the Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation, and last but not least, my husband, Robert D. Turner, who's been my personal photographer, and so much more. Next slide, please. I especially want to extend a great deal of gratitude and appreciation to all of the Indigenous knowledge holders who have been my teachers for over 50 years. As John mentioned, I started doing work as an undergraduate student at the University of Victoria when I was in my third year and did my honors thesis working with this man, Christopher Paul of Tsartlip. And since that time, I've had the privilege and pleasure of learning from so many wonderful, kind, and knowledgeable teachers. And some of them are listed here. I'll just go around and name them because these are just a few, but some of these are key people I'll be talking about tonight. Starting in the upper left with Elsie Claxton from Saanich, Elsie's daughter Belinda, Celelia Claxton, and our friend Sethlama Joan Morris from Songhees. Clan Chief Adam Dick with the Kincum River in the background there. Sam Mitchell from Hatlip. Clan Chief Adam Dick is from the Kwakwakwa Sawadena First Nation. Sam Mitchell from Hatlip in the Slatlimuk or Lillooet. Dr. Mary Thomas, who received an honorary degree from UVic in 2001, I believe, from the Shwetmuk Nation. Dr. Margaret Sywallis from Nuhalk, Bellacoola. Annie York from Spuzzum and Tlakatmuk. Dr. Chief Ron Ignace from Skeetchiston and Shwetmuk Nation. Dr. Umik Richard Atleo from Ahousaht, Nuu-Channel Nation. Christopher Paul, I mentioned, from Tsartlip, Saanich. Chief Ernie Hill from the Gitgat Nation. Ida Jones from the Dididat Nation. And my dear friend Ki'iljuice Barbara Wilson from Haida Gwaii. These are just some of the many people who I've learned from over the years. Next slide, please. So today, I just want to talk about Indigenous knowledge systems and some of the concepts that I've learned about in talking to people and learning their stories and learning their practices and activities and the way they look at the world. And maybe talk about some of the lessons that we can learn from this knowledge. These are blueberries up in the Heiltsuk territory, growing beside a waterfall where they grow very lush. And this was the site of one of the berry gardens that I learned about from the Heiltsuk territory. Next slide, please. So since time immemorial, since the beginning of time, as my friend Kwaksistala Clan Chief Adam Dick would say, people have lived here. Archaeologists keep pushing the time frame back. We have at least 14,000 years and possibly much longer that people have lived here along the coast in places where the ice had receded from the last Pleistocene glaciation. And people right from that time on have had a high reliance on marine resources as well as terrestrial resources and have really their cultures have been shaped by their environments and the maritime lifestyles that they've led. Resilient and resourceful people, they've always been learning about new things, exchanging ideas, and sharing and adapting over millennia. And I have to stress that they're as vibrant and as active today as ever before. Next slide, please. Over 50 different languages are spoken in British Columbia alone, or in northwestern North America, I should say, if we go from Alaska south to the Columbia River and east to the Rockies. That's the kind of area that I'm talking about. And these peoples have used hundreds of different species of plants and animals, fish and seafood, mammals, and many, many different kinds of plant foods, greens, root vegetables, and berries, and so forth, inner bark of trees, and use plants and animals, but especially plants as sources of materials and medicines. And as well as just the practical uses, people have developed a wealth of stories and ceremonies and traditions that relate to their use of these resources and these different species. And as I mentioned, there's strong evidence that people have shared their knowledge, their techniques and what they've learned, their values across this linguistic and geographic and ecological space. Next slide, please. These are two maps drawn by my friend Dr. Nancy Mackin, and they show the diversity that we have. On the left-hand side is the linguistic diversity, showing approximately the territories of the different language groups. And on the right, just the major vegetation zones over the same area, with numerous subzones and specific habitats within each one of those zones. So when you put the diversity of the people together with the ecosystems, you get this tremendous eco-cultural diversity. And that's what I've been learning about over the many decades now. The next slide, please. My friend Fikret Burkus from the University of Manitoba, also retired now, but still going strong, wrote a book called Sacred Ecology that highlights Indigenous knowledge of peoples around the world. And he called it sacred because although it parallels scientific knowledge, but there is a worldview dimension to this knowledge that is, it's to do with values and the way people regard the knowledge and the resources that they use. And he defines traditional knowledge or Indigenous knowledge as follows: a cumulative body of knowledge, practice, and belief, evolving by adaptive processes and handed down through generations by cultural transmission. And this is from his first edition of Sacred Ecology, but it's into its fourth edition now. And this photo is one of my very favorite all-time photos that I've ever taken. This is of Mrs. Helen Clifton from the Gitgat Nation at Hartley Bay with her little granddaughter, Janelle. Janelle's pretty well grown up now, but this picture shows the way the way knowledge is passed on. And often it's done by learning by doing, by having kids around and just having them do whatever the grown-ups are doing. And here Helen is pounding the dried halibut with a yew-wood mallet. And Janelle is pounding dried halibut with her little mallet. And she's just having fun with her grandma. But she will remember that her whole life. She will know all about halibut walks as she grows up. And she'll one day be teaching this to her grandchildren. Next slide, please. So these are some of the components of Indigenous knowledge systems. Of course, there's a lot of practical knowledge that people hold about the seasons, about when the berries are ripe or when the fish come up the river, how to harvest, where to go, how to process their food, what's poisonous and what's not, all of those things that you need to know to survive. So there's a lot of knowledge that goes, that can be in this category. But as well, as I mentioned, there's the overarching kind of belief system that goes with that knowledge. And it embodies respect and gratitude and appreciation for the world, the water, the plants and animals that we rely on. And also it requires responsibility towards those things. The way knowledge is passed on through, as I said, experiential learning, but also through formal instruction, language, stories, ceremonies, and so forth. And governance, decision-making, planning and decision-making processes are part of that knowledge system. So the way that leaders are appointed or take on those roles. The way people have the proprietorship over different resources and lands and the responsibility to care for them and monitor them over time. And this knowledge is continuous, but it goes in cyclical time frame, extending back into the past, over the generations, over the seasons, even over the days and nights. And there's Richard Atleo at the Atleo River, across from a Hauset. And this is an area that he has the hahotli, the responsibility for looking after this place as part of his chieftainship's duties. Next slide, please. This is a diagram that we developed with Ron and Marianne Ignace from the Secwepemc Nation, just showing I had all of these traits and attributes of traditional knowledge listed in a table with columns and little compartments. And Marianne and Ron looked at that and just laughed. And of course, that's not the way traditional knowledge is at all. It's very holistic. And so this is our attempt to show how all of these different types of knowledge are all interconnected with each other and grounded in a philosophy, or based on a philosophy of the power of all things, respect and reciprocity. That's very important, and as well as attachment to people's lands and their homelands and their places, and the responsibility to look after them. Next slide, please. And here's Cecilia Belinda Claxton. She's harvesting cedar bark from a tree at Yellow Point. And before she started to harvest, she actually talked to the tree and asked permission to take a strip of bark from it. So this just shows we all need to use other species to live, to stay alive, and that's recognized. But what is seen in Indigenous knowledge systems is the respect and appreciation to each and every species that gives their lives for us or gives parts of us to us. And we owe, in turn, we owe respect and we owe caring to all of these things. The next slide. This is from the unpublished notes of ethnographer James Tate from the Nkatmuch. And I found it in his own handwriting. Flowers, plants, and grass, especially the latter, are the covering or blanket of the earth. If too much plucked or ruthlessly destroyed, earth sorry and weeps, it rains or is angry and makes rain, fog, and bad weather. And this is just another example of how people see the earth as a living being, and the name for grass and the plants that cover the earth is Duyum. It means ground hair. It's like the hair of Mother Earth. And of course, we have to treat it very carefully and with respect, or there will be consequences. That's what this is saying. The next slide, please. And there's Quaxistalawatla. He passed away in 2018, but to us, he's still very much with us in his teachings and the ideas that he shared over time with us. And it was his words that in Kwakwala language that inspired the book that I edited with Doug Doerr, my friend and colleague, called Keeping It Living, because Adam had a word for that in his language. And it seemed like a really good way of expressing the way people harvest and use plants. They use them with great care, and they sustain them through different practices. They use fire and they clear areas to create a mosaic of different successional stages for forests. They partially harvest from trees, from living plants, perennials. They weed and till the soil, prune and coppice the berry bushes to make them more productive. They plant and replant and transplant plants, and they've been doing it for a long time. They create structural changes like terracing, as in the clam gardens that have become so well known in the last couple of decades. And it was Quaxistala himself who explained about the clam gardens, the Loki way, that were created by rolling rocks from the beach down to the lowest tide line to create these big clear beaches that were ideal for clams. Monitoring not just over days or seasons, but over generations to see what's changing, what the effects on different populations are. And all of this knowledge is embedded in stories and in the language itself. And it's part of every young person's training and education. And some people become specialists in one area and some in another, but that's all part of the overall management system. Next slide, please. Thank you. We call this kind of the association that people have with all the living things around us as kincentricity. It's a different perspective. We know that all the living things around the world are related to us humans, but we often don't treat them as kin or as relations. In Indigenous societies around the world, it's much more common to see the trees and the animals and the fish even as relatives of us humans, and the way we treat them is reflected in that relationship. So these time-honored systems of looking after populations of plants and animals are really important, and they spread out into social organization, into people's movements around the land, into learning, into ceremony, songs, and the way knowledge is exchanged. For example, the spirits of the forest, or the Atlakima dance, is a wonderful example that was hosted by Quaxistala at a symposium that we organized at the University of Victoria in 2017. And this dance performance was a lesson to a young man who went hunting, and he shot grouse. It was very easy to kill grouse because they're somewhat slow birds sometimes. And he was very proud because he got all these grouse. But that night when he went to sleep, he was visited by the spirits of the forest, led by the grouse himself, and taught through the dance performance of all of the beings of the forest, the water, the winds, the trees, the birds, the fish, and so forth, dancing in front of him, how important the grouse and all the other species were to the functioning of the forest. And when he awoke, he realized that he'd done the wrong thing by taking too many grouse. He learned his lesson, and that's the one of the ways that knowledge is taught and passed on over generations. Next slide, please. So I want to give you just a couple of examples, and one of them is one of my favorite plants, the camas. There are actually two species of edible camas, and they're lilies that have edible bulbs. The bulbs have to be cooked for a long time because their main carbohydrate is a complex of fructans, sugars that are long chain sugars and difficult for us to digest. But with proper cooking, like in an underground pit, the inulin breaks down into fructose and the bulbs become very sweet and very tasty. And they were formerly a major food for the Coast Salish peoples here on Vancouver Island. And we figured that going by the evidence that we were told from Christopher Paul, who I mentioned from Sartlip, he talked about a family of maybe 10 people digging a 200-pound gunny sack of camas bulbs in one season. And that would do that family for the winter. And if you multiply that out by the number of families in a community and the number of communities on southeastern Vancouver Island, it actually comes out to about 10 million bulbs a year that people were harvesting on Vancouver Island alone. So it's amazing the care that people had to be able to maintain that over generations, that level of harvesting. Next slide, please. My friend and former doctoral student, Dr. Brenda Beckwith, did her PhD work looking at camas cultivation and trying to figure out how did people actually produce that amount of camas bulbs in a year. And she planted out camas bulbs that were salvaged from the highway widening around Goldstream into cold frames at Government House, and she observed them over a 5-year period. And look at the size of the bulbs that came from that planting. She was weeding them and just tending them, and they were well spaced. They were splitting apart and forming 2 or 3 bulbs at a time, and seeding themselves as they went. So that just shows what a little bit of tender, loving care can do for a plant like that. The camas are just coming up now. They'll be blooming within a month or so. Next slide, please. So all around southern Vancouver Island, there were these beautiful prairies interspersed with groves of oak. And they were just fields of camas as far as you could see. When the first Europeans arrived, they saw this beautiful landscape with the wildflowers just coloring the hills blue. I've seen the camas meadows in eastern Washington and Oregon that really do look like lakes. It's incredible to see them. And people there, the Nez Perce and the Okanagan Colville people, all relied on camas bulbs as well. Next slide, please. So the famous anthropologist Wayne Suttles, who worked in this area, he learned about looking after camas beds from some of the women that he interviewed at the Tzoke Nation. And one woman in particular, it was her responsibility to look after burning over the camas meadow after the bulbs had been harvested. And she had the ownership or the proprietorship of that particular meadow. And other people could dig there, but they needed to ask permission and they needed to follow the right rules for harvesting and looking after the camas patch. Okay, next slide, please. And yeah, as he recorded, they didn't just dig anywhere. Stakes marked them, women owned them, and they would fight for their claims. If someone came to a woman's plot, she would quarrel. If the owner died, a near relative got the plot. So these weren't just kind of open to anyone, but people had the rights to them, but they also had the responsibility to look after them. Next slide, please. And Ida Jones, who I mentioned earlier from the Dididat Nation, I worked with her and my friend Harriet Kuhnlein, who's a nutritionist living in Anacortes at the moment. But she was with McGill, Center for Indigenous Peoples, Nutrition and Environment. And she and Ida's son, John Thomas, and I learned about pit cooking from Ida, who as a young woman had gone out with the root diggers and harvested camas from the Victoria area, and the root vegetables, clover and silverweed, springbank clover and Pacific silverweed, and they would cook them in an underground pit. So Harriet and John and I learned from Ida, and we practiced doing pit cooking under her watchful eye. And the first time we did it, the roots were all raw, and the second time they were burned, but we did it a few times and we managed to get the hang of it and make pretty tasty root vegetables from the pit cooking process. Next slide. Thanks. Alice Paul from Heshquiat, who I worked with in the 80s with Dr. Barbara Efrat from the museum. She talked about coming to Victoria when she was a young woman and bringing back camas bulbs and planting them in the meadow behind Heshquiat village. And they also transplanted cattail into the village lake in behind Heshquiat village. And the more I talked to people, the more I realized they were doing that all the time with roots, with fibrous plants, with berry bushes. They were transplanting plants all over the place, stinging nettle and so forth. Next slide, please. Brenda and I were advising another researcher, Kate Proctor, for her master's, and she worked also on camas production at the Somnos Gary Oak Center Preserve at Duncan. And this shows all the camas bulbs that were present in one plot, one of Kate's plots, a meter square, if you can imagine. All of those bulbs were in a meter square plot. And you can see on the left, the tiny little ones are 1-year-old bulbs, and then there's 2-year-old bulbs and 3-year-old. And by the time the bulbs are 4 years old or so, they start to elongate and they push their way down into the soil. And so by the time they're 6 or 7 or 8 years old and ready to be harvested, they're about 10 centimeters or more down into the soil. And the digger would dig around in a circle and dig down using this wonderful implement, the digging stick, and then pry back the turf and flip it over. And they could reach down and just pick out the bulbs that they wanted after they'd gone to seed. So they're knocking the seeds into the soil while they're digging, and then put the turf back, maybe weed out some of the grasses, but the younger bulbs then have a chance to grow down into that newly tilled soil. And then they would give it a quick burn over the top, and that would give a shot of nutrients into the crevices left with the digging. And that was how people maintained these camas beds over really, it seems like thousands of years. The bulbs it was just a continuous production system on about a 4 or 5 year rotation. And so they'd move from one area to another over those intervening years and then come back and there'd be a whole new crop of camas bulbs there. Next slide, please. And people were so intimately associated with their camas plots that my friend Darcy Matthews, who is an archaeologist and as well as an ethnobotanist, who wrote his PhD dissertation on funerary ritual and ancestral presence in camas areas. And he found that there was 100% relationship between burial mounds and camas harvesting sites. He also found, you could say he discovered, at least as a Westerner, discovered culturally modified old growth Douglas fir trees where people had taken elk antler wedges and broken off slabs of fir bark from these big old trees. And fir bark is very hot burning. And this bark was used as a fuel in the funerary rites of people who were being interred in these funeral burial mounds, right in the presence of the Camas Meadows. So it shows, as he wrote, through the practice of funerary ritual, successive deaths build landscapes, places that are physical, spiritual, social, and metaphorical. Next slide, please. And then another example is with the production of berries. There are about 50 different kinds of berries that people used across British Columbia. And some of them are quite sweet tasting and juicy. Some of them are not quite as tasty, but they all have their own flavors and their own characteristics. They all have their own names in the different languages. And people maintain berry bushes, again, through various means: pruning, fertilizing, transplanting. They burned over areas to create these ideal open places where berry bushes flourished, and the production was very high. And people would harvest these berries and cook them and dry them in cakes for winter. They were key important sources of nutrients, as well as for antioxidants and other health-giving nutrients that they got from these berries. Next slide. One example is soapberry, which is one that not too many people outside of Indigenous communities have actually tried. And if you do try them, you might find them a little bit tart, but you can develop a taste for these berries, and they're very healthy. They're rich in vitamin A and C and in iron. They're looked on as a health food, but also as a party food, because they have a natural detergent in them that makes them whip. When you add a little bit of water to them, you can whip them up with a special whipper, or even with your hands, or with a bunch of grass or a handful of salal branches, into this frothy confection that used to be called Indian ice cream. It's not exactly ice cream because it's not even cold, but it looks like ice cream. It's more like whipped pink egg whites. And this was always served up in big bowls at parties. All of my friends remember from the time they were little how much they enjoyed these big soapberry feasts or parties. There's lots of stories about them as well. So a very important food for British Columbia First Peoples. In fact, I often say it's a made in British Columbia food, because although these bushes grow right across Canada, it only seems to be in British Columbia where they made this special confection from the berries. Next slide, please. High bush cranberries are another berry that aren't widely known outside of Indigenous communities, but they're a favorite for people everywhere. They have a lot of trade value. They're used as gifts and as the feasts, chief's feasts. The bushes are pruned, and the patches are owned by different people in different places. So they're really an important food that have a lot of history to them, probably going way, way back to the beginning of when people came into this area. Next slide. And crab apples are kind of equivalent to the high bush cranberries in the status that they give people, in the amount of use that they had. They're both harvested in the fall. The trees and the cranberry bushes are looked after, and groves are owned by different families and individuals. Both of the fruits were not dried into cakes like the juicier, sweeter berries, but rather they were stored underwater with a layer of oil on the top. And over the winter, they just get softer and sweeter. Next slide, please. Oh, that was Marjorie Hill, by the way, sorting crab apples. She was Chief Ernie Hill's mom. And she knew the names for 5 different varieties of crab apples used by the Gitgat Nation up in Hartley Bay and vicinity. They're called moloks, but they had other names like Gasassi, the crow's crab apples, depending on their flavor and the type of trees they were growing on and the length of their stems and their color and everything. So that just shows how important they were. Sorry, next slide. There are about 20 species of Vaccinium, the blueberry, huckleberry, cranberry genus, and all of them were important. They all had their own names and a lot of traditions around going out and picking these berries and looking after the bushes and so forth. Next slide, please. And just to show you, this is just one example of all the different names that the red huckleberry has in all the different languages. Squatchus in the Saanich language, and Skadalhu in the Haida language, and so forth. Simmai in Gitxsan, that means real berry. So these are very important, just as reflected in the names. Squadums, all of these names, and this is just one of the berries. Next slide, please. Thanks. And here's a few more, just some photos showing the great variety I mentioned the variety of crab apples that you can see as Marjorie Hill's holding them in her hand there. The salmon berries have the golden form, the red form or ruby form, and the dark form. The evergreen huckleberries have a light blue form and a dark shiny black form. And Saskatoons have many different varieties that are named in different languages. In the Slatlimuk language, for example, the overall name for Saskatoon is Shakum. And then there's one kind that's called Shakum Ul, which means the real, original Saskatoon berry. And then there's the Spakpak, which means white. It has little white hairs on it. And the Skolko Ulcha, the red ones, and the Chakalus. And then there's one called Nak Uksha, which is the rotten one. They say they get rotten before they even get ripe, and nobody would pick those ones, but they were recognized nevertheless as one of the varieties. And it just shows the intimate knowledge that people had of these. The same even with the bunchberry. Marjorie Hill said there's 2 different kinds. One has long teardrop-shaped fruits and the other is round. And sure enough, there they were growing together pretty well in the same place, but very different looking fruit. Next slide, please. And many of these, as I mentioned, were improved by the occasional controlled burn over an area that kept the brush down and gave a shot of fertilizer to the berry bushes. And all around southern Vancouver Island and over on Salt Spring, people had used fire. And one of the best accounts of fire was by Baptist Ritchie from Mount Currie, the Lillooet people north of Whistler. He told a story in his own language and then translated it into English called Burning Mountainsides for Better Crops. And he's the one who mentioned all of the different berries grow much better and the root vegetables grow much better after a fire. Next slide, please. This is from Sam Mitchell, who I mentioned earlier from the Slatlimuk Nation. They would burn every 5 or 6 years. Now it's only timber grows. It takes away from the other. They burned at Lillooet to make the raspberries and west of Lillooet for the huckleberries. And so this was something that people did routinely, but around the birth of Smokey the Bear, around that time, the forestry officials started banning people burning. and they weren't able to burn anymore. And all of the elders said after that, the bushes grew up and the berries aren't nearly as productive as they used to be. Next slide, please. And they pruned them. Here's the words of Quaxistala again. As soon as they pick off all the berries, we break them, so the berries will grow plentifully next year. A lot of people think we never touched the wild berries, but we did. We cultivated it. We pruned it, especially the guadams, the red huckleberries. When they finished picking the guadams, they pruned them. They break the tops off. Okay, next slide. And ownership, again, everybody had their own berry patches, just like everyone had their own clam beds. Things like salal patches, yeah, salmon berries and all that. All kinds of berries, wild crabapple. You don't just go out and pick. There's certain places that a family goes. Anything that's pegged, if you put pegs around a crabapple tree, then you know it's someone's. Okay, next slide, please. And some of these berries, as I mentioned, they might not be too tasty. They might be a little bit tart, but they have a special quality in that they stay on the bushes over the winter, and you can go and harvest them if you know where to find them, even under the snow. So that makes them very special in times of shortage that people face from time to time, especially towards the end of the winter. Next slide. And of course, it's recognized how important all of these plants are to the animals that people depend on as well. And so people were always careful to make sure there was enough for the deer and the bear and the other the birds, that they had their share as well. Next slide, please. I guess we can't make this sound, the song of the salmonberry bird. It would be on my original, but not on this PDF file. But the salmonberry bird in the Saanich Sanchathan language sings to the salmonberries. The salmonberry bird is a Swainson thrush, and it has a beautiful high fluty voice, sort of I can't do it nearly as well as the bird itself does, but it's a beautiful song, and it's singing to the different varieties of salmonberries to get them to ripen. And if you've been out there when the salmonberries are ripen and you hear the salmonberry bird, you could almost swear you can watch them ripen. Next slide, please. And sometimes we can learn about the traditions by looking at some of the stories. And there's a wonderful Nuxalk story that Thomas McElraith recorded in his book on the Bella Coola Indians, the Nuxalk, about how Raven stole the soapberry whip and brought soapberries to the Bella Coola Valley. He was invited to a feast by a mountain that was a chief in those old early days, and they sat inside the mountain, and the chief served them soapberry whip, and Raven wanted to get some for his people, so he grabbed some in his beak. He caused the door to the mountain to be opened, and he flew out over the coast mountains and down into the Bella Coola Valley. He was so excited he couldn't resist. And as he called out, the berry whip fell from his beak down onto the head of the valley, and wherever it landed, the soapberry bushes grew, but he never made it to Bella Coola. There's no soapberry bushes down in Bella Coola itself. Next slide, please. People transplanted berry bushes and other plants all the time, as I mentioned. Emma Nice from the Niska Nation at Gitwin-Silk told me the story of her grandmother who was blind, and her grandfather brought berry bushes, Saskatoon, elderberry, crabapple, and even black hawthorn, and planted them in the yard around their house because she loved picking berries, and she could go out and pick berries even then when she wasn't able to see. And those bushes are still growing there around their yard. Next slide, please. So that's that story. Harry Nice is Emma's son. Harry Nice Sr. and Dr. Deanna Nice is married to Harry, and they told me this story as well. Next slide, please. And there they are, the Saskatoons, the black hawthorn, crabapple. All of those are still there in 2013. Next slide. And they transplanted kinnikinnick and soapberries as well down beside ancient rock carving by the Nass River. That was pretty amazing to see those bushes there and to know that they'd been brought, especially and planted in that place. Next slide. And then, as I mentioned, the berries that in the Heiltsuk territory, my friends Cyril Carpenter and Pauline Waterfall, their grandmothers both told them the same story, that long ago people had berry gardens. They were set beside waterfalls up in Roscoe Inlet and elsewhere. And they planted berry bushes beside the waterfalls in a south-facing slope so they'd get the best sunlight and lots of moisture. And they fertilized them with fish remains and the remains of trapped animals and so forth. And they would just pick the berries off by the handful, they said. We went out to try and find those berry gardens, but we're not sure whether we found them or not because they would have been about 80 years old at that point. The trees would have grown up all around them. Next slide, please. There's a beautiful place called Robintown up on the Kitsim-Kalem River, the territory of the Kitsim-Kalem and inland Tsimshian people from that region. And this has got an amazing combination of plants that people would have brought: crab apples and rice root, stinging nettle, highbush cranberry, hazelnut, elderberry, all of these growing together in the same place, wild ginger and devil's club, and I mentioned rice root. And this is what we've called an orchard garden. There's been a lot of work now on how people actually manage these constellations of different plants. And that's just one example. Next slide, please. So all of these ways that people had of looking after the plants and teaching their children about them, taking the leadership and responsibility for them and so forth. These are all different strategies that are still in place today to bring food security and to help people to maintain their traditional foods and their food traditions that have been so healthy for them. The next slide, please. And just in passing, I think it's not a secret that the people who arrived from Europe conveniently overlooked all of these practices that people had, the indigenous management systems. And they didn't recognize them. They thought they were works of nature, and they succeeded in taking over a lot of the land and turning it into dairy land or growing wheat or other European types of agriculture without recognizing that it already was a managed landscape. Next slide, please. People didn't believe that we did this. They think nature just grows on its own. My friend Maya Nish, Dr. Daisy Seawood Smith said, but our people felt to get more harvest and bigger berries, they did these things. Same thing a farmer does. Next slide. So these kinds of strategies were applied right across the spectrum of different foods that people used. I've given you just a few examples, but they pertain to fisheries, to shellfish harvesting, and to all the different kinds of plants that people used. Next slide, please. And they're still going on today. There have been changes and adaptations with climate change. People aren't able to dry their seaweed in the traditional way in many cases. So they have to use freezers and then bring it out later to dry in the summer when the rains have stopped. And people use jars and freezers these days, but they're still using these foods. They're as important as they ever were. Next slide, please. And final thoughts. As I say, this knowledge and the practices and the values that go with them are still being transmitted, maybe using more modern modes of communication like cell phones and computers in some cases, and embracing some new species, new words, new techniques all the time. But the processes and the relationships remain and are as important as they always were. Next slide, please. So thank you for your attention. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation and given you just a few insights into this complex, wonderful system that people have had for caring for their lands and their home places over all these years. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Nancy. That was a marvelous presentation into a zone that I certainly don't know much about, and I'm certainly appreciative, as I'm sure all the participants are. Now, I think the next stage is to answer a few questions from the audience, and I'll just, if it's okay, I'll just read some off.
Sure.
Yeah, I'll just take one here. It kind of pertains to something you just mentioned, and the question is: did early European explorers or settlers see any plant? When everyone's moving on me here, where did it go? Oh, here it is. See any plant? Did any early European explorers or settlers see any plant and medicinal resources as valuable and take them to sell?
Oh, that's a very good question. Yes, there was a lot of learning from the First Nations right across North America about plants that were good to eat and plants that were used for medicine as well as for materials. And there was a lot of adopting of those plants by European settlers right across the country. Things like cranberries and all of the berries, especially choke cherries and so forth. The settlers quickly learned to use those. And then, of course, there are a whole range of medicinal plants that people used that are still being used today and as herbal medicines. One of the best known is, of course, cascara, which was used by First Nations throughout its range for digestive problems, as a laxative and as a tonic. Sometimes by itself and sometimes in combination with other tree barks. But that soon became adopted into the pharmacopoeia of Europeans, and many, in fact, a number of the people I worked with, the Indigenous people, earned some money when they were younger, usually in their teens or their early adulthood, by harvesting cascara bark and selling it to the local pharmaceutical companies. And the tradition for harvesting bark medicine for First Nations is you never girdle the tree. You take a strip from the tree, a long strip, and you would harvest from multiple trees if you need more bark, but you'd never take bark around the entire tree because that would kill the tree. But some harvesters who harvested it commercially, not First Nations, I would imagine, but others did girdle the trees, and the cascara tree became quite rare at times, and pretty soon they had to ban people from harvesting cascara bark from the wild, and they started growing it in plantations. And so most of today's cascara bark, which is still used, and you can find it in pharmacies or and certainly in herbal medicine shops, but it's usually from plantation trees now.
Yeah, just kind of a follow-up question came in from another participant. Did any of these plants have hallucinogenic properties?
Oh, that's another good question, and one that people have been asking a lot lately, because there's been kind of an interest in hallucinogenic plants, and as a therapy, not just for recreation, but in a serious way for therapy for some kinds of, especially mental conditions. But to my knowledge, the medicinal plants that people used weren't specifically hallucinogenic. Although the way that people took medicines and the way they did training for either for becoming a healer or becoming a medical practitioner would involve using those medicines along with fasting and other ceremonial forms of training that would probably have led to similar conditions to being hallucinogenic, if that makes any sense. So you might, if you've gone without food for a while and you're taking certain medicines, you might have visions, and that's the way people learned about their special spirits that were helping spirits and so forth. But it's not something that outsiders outside of a culture or a community know very much about, and we're not supposed to know very much about it. It's not something that is talked about a great deal.
Yeah. Okay, another question. I think we have time for two more.
Sure.
Okay. Could you please talk about the importance of incorporating some of the native plants you've mentioned into urban gardens?
Oh, yes. Well, camas is a great example. I have in our house in Victoria, where our daughter is living right now, we have a beautiful plot of camas growing, and it can be readily grown in a garden. You just have to remember that you can't harvest it annually. It's not an annual plant, and many of these plants that I've been learning about are not annuals. In fact, almost all of the plants that are used for food are perennials. So you need to think about them in the same way that you might think about an asparagus patch or an orchard or a berry patch. So you can buy some of these species like evergreen huckleberry and even red huckleberry and some of the other native fruits in nurseries. You can also propagate them with cuttings if you know what you're doing. And you can buy seed of camas. It takes a while to grow, but it's easy to grow, and within 5 or 6 years you can start growing it and harvest enough to eat. There are all kinds of the berries, and I grow stinging nettle, as well. It makes a really nice green vegetable when you cook it, like a spinach substitute. You can grow wild ginger, which is a really nice scent plant. You can grow the springbank clover. I have a lot of it growing in a box here in our garden. So yeah, there's a lot that could be done. And there's a lot of interest amongst First Nations communities up and down the coast in starting to use these food plants again and growing them in gardens and so forth. So it's really nice to see.
Yeah. Another question, again, related to growing things, is something that struck this participant was how lush the lands are that in the region you discussed. And I'm wondering what sorts of differences would be observed in more harsh environments such as the prairies or the desert.
Yeah, that's a good question. They all have their own particular, I guess, plant resources that are adapted to growing in those particular environments. So on the prairies, for example, there's a lot of variety. We think of the prairies as being pretty much uniform wheat fields nowadays, but in the past, certainly, and to some extent in the present, there are wetlands, there are creeks, there are ponds, and so forth, and these have their own constellations of plants, from cattails and other plants that grow around wet areas to the prairie turnip and plants that grow up in the foothills of the Rockies again. And in the desert, there's all kinds of plants that people use, from agave and mesquite and many kinds of cacti and some of the spring flowering plants as well. So yeah, everywhere you go, people, the indigenous peoples of that area know about and use many different species. Although we do happen to have in British Columbia pretty much of a phenomenal constellation of species that we have access to.
Yeah.
Of course,
And just
Saskatoon berries is a perfect example of a prairie plant that people have used, and the city of Saskatoon is named after the Cree name for that plant, Misaskatoomina. So, yeah.
Just as a final question, one of the participants, I wonder if we could use fire with care in some of our local parks and gardens. Does putting some ash around berry plants help with nutrients? In other words, does ash serve as the fertilizer?
Yeah, it absolutely does. And if you go to an area where there has been a burn, for example, as I was up near Sam Mitchell's homeland at Haklip a few years back, there was a fire that spread up a hillside just before you come into the village. And I got out of the car there and I walked up the hill. And I was amazed to see wild onions. They call them kwalawa ul. They're the real original onion. Kwalawa is onion. And they were well, you can't see my hand, I guess, but they were as long as my arm, as tall as my arm is long, growing, when normally they might grow, 20 centimeters or so. But after a fire, they were just incredible. And the stories like the story that Baptist Ritchie told about burning mountainsides for better crops. And the other elders will tell you that not only the onions, but the tiger lily bulbs and the other root vegetables, the tiger lily bulbs can get as big as a tennis ball, they say. And the mountain potatoes, the Claytonia, or it has a lot of different names, Squaquina, Tutuan, and Tsuntini and the Chilcotin, where Potato Mountain is named after these root vegetables in the Claytonia, in the same family as bitterroot, the purslane family. They get to be as big as golf balls. whereas nowadays you hardly see them that big. But yeah, the ashes from the fire will help for sure as a shot of nutrients.
Wow. So this could become a local phenomena here in Victoria.
Just be careful. You don't want to burn down Government House or anything like that.
Well, there's a lot of stone buildings around. Anyway, thank you once again for sharing your broad spectrum of your knowledge. It was absolutely inspirational, and sharing the insight and your understandings that you've provided for us. It's greatly appreciated. And you certainly introduced us to some very interesting friends and colleagues. So thank you very much for that.
Thanks
and also
so
for
much,
those
John.
who are tuning in, thank you for doing so and participating in this presentation. It's been a great evening. Tomorrow, you will get an email from the Institute on Aging and Lifelong Health, instigated by none other than Leah Potter, asking for some feedback on our presentations. And it'd be great if you would provide that for us. And as a reminder, Masterminds series goes every Wednesday this month in April, so there's 3 more to come. Next week, we're very pleased to have Dr. Cecilia Benoit do a presentation, provocatively entitled, I think, Commercial Sex, a problem of gender or social inequality. So with that, I thank you very much, Nancy, and I wish everyone a good evening, and you don't have to drive home, which is kind of neat.
Very nice. Thank you very much, John, and thanks all of you for being with us tonight.
Okay, thank you.